Two branches diverged in Git, and sad I could not push to both. I merged the branch less traveled by, and now all of the builds are broken. Good morning, and thank you for coming to Terrible Ideas in Git on what we like to call the hangover track. For those of you who've dragged yourselves here, congratulations and thank you. This talk was adapted from a class I used to teach called Terrible Ideas in Git, Git for Systems Administrators. And I did that as a traveling consultant at a lot of different places. I've seen a lot of different workflows involving this. These days, I don't travel as much. I'm the director of DevOps at a company in San Francisco called Future Advisor. My contact information is up there, as is my Twitter handle. Please feel free to tweet at me throughout the course of this talk.
We tweet you?
Tweet, yes. Okay, let's talk about Git. Okay. Where are we? There we go, okay. I'm going to start this class with a promise, specifically that everyone in here is going to learn something today. I don't care if you're one of the Git authors. You're going to learn exactly how I mistreat your baby. And before I get too far into it, one thing that I want to call out is I'm about to point out an awful lot of really stupid things in Git. And the reason I know that these are stupid, boneheaded moves are because I've done all of them. The only person I'm really making fun of here is past me. We're all learning, and this is the best way that I've found to, I guess, fix mistakes, is own it. Turn it into a presentation. Make fun of yourself. There's no shame in it. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Who here uses Git? Who here wishes they used Git? Who here is just raising their hands because they're staring at their phone and wants to pretend they're engaged? There we go. Okay, so what is Git? Git tracks changes to files and directories over time. It lets us collaborate with each other. It's very simple at its heart, which is invariably why in these presentations the next slide looks like this.
No, I don't.
Yeah, it's about as clear as mud. And there's an elephant in the room. So let's go ahead and introduce it. No matter who you are, Git makes you feel dumb. It's very complex and gets screamingly difficult very quickly. The only question is how far down the rabbit hole can you go before it leaves you feeling like you are completely lost and diving for Stack Overflow as fast as you can. But why is Git this complex? I mean, a simple tool shouldn't be this difficult to learn. Why is it so hard to understand? Apropos of nothing, Git was written by Linus Torvalds, who is famous for three things. Writing Git, which is why everyone is here in this room right now. Creating Linux, which is why everyone is here at this conference to begin with. And tearing people to pieces on various mailing lists.
Have you NVIDIA?
So, despite its complexity, Git does let you do extremely powerful things. And by powerful, I, of course, mean stupid. There we are. So I'm going to create a Git repository. I'm going to add my local files into this Git repository. And then it hangs. This is one of the first indications that you're doing something you probably shouldn't be. Local operations are designed to be fast. So when it hangs on a local operation that it really shouldn't, that's your first indication that something's dumb. So now it goes ahead and it tells me that I've added one file called ubuntu.iso.
Oh no.
And sure enough, there it is. It's created a .git repository, a .git subdirectory inside the repository, which is now 173 megs. So, I've done something stupid. I can probably fix this. Now, if I do a git status, sure enough, it's not tracking that giant binary anymore. But it's still in the history here. It makes obvious sense to some extent when you're looking at this. In a giant binary context. You can commit large binaries to Git, and you can also commit atrocities in Git. Git is not designed to handle this. If you find yourself needing to do that, there are two options. Git Annex is written by Joey Hess, a former Debian developer, and Git's LFS, which is being pushed rather hard by GitHub at the moment, which is a competing way of solving the same problem. And they effectively wind up storing these large binaries elsewhere and then linking against them using either symlinks or some other methodology under the hood. Now, most of us aren't committing binaries after the first time that we make that mistake, but we're often committing things that we shouldn't be. For example, secrets. If you want to strip out secrets or giant binaries, how do you fix what I just demonstrated? Well, there are two ways. The first is an arcane command called git filter branch, and it's obnoxious. And once it's been pushed, you wind up having to do a force push. Everyone else gets conflicts when they wind up pulling, and that's not great. And there's a Java tool that makes this simpler called BFG, which works relatively well. Where I work at Future Advisor, we are committing secrets to Git. We're just encrypting them with GPG first, because that makes the problem more or less go away. Other approaches to this problem don't tend to work as well. For example, the second worst idea I've ever seen was, we just copy the credentials to production from a developer's laptop. The first worst idea I ever saw was submodules. This is not just a theoretical caution. There have been exploits that abound by people searching on GitHub or code.google.com back before they killed it mercilessly, of looking for AMI keys. People would wind up committing their credentials for Amazon. Someone else would grab it, spin up a bunch of instances to mine Bitcoin, and by the time it was captured, they would already be gone. People post private certs to these things. It's a problem. Let's move on to another terrible idea. You can, I don't even know what I'd call this. Remember how I said that Git can make anyone's head hurt? Okay, so I'm creating a Git repository here. What this does is it builds out an entire directory structure in a hidden .git folder. It has head, which winds up pointing to what current commit you're on. It has a directory that contains different branch information. It has a localized configuration for the repository, and a few other things as well. But on disk, all that Git is a series of files and directories inside of your repository. And that's easy to keep track of. In fact, I have a tool I like to use for that. You can go deeper and do it again if you want. On a related note, how many times have you started typing a command? And personally, I am a full Stack Overflow developer. So often, I'm copying and pasting stuff all day long from Stack Overflow in here. So you start typing a command, you go and you get the thing, and you copy it back. And then you feel like an idiot.
Oh no!
And then it works.
Oh no!
right? Something very similar to this will make Docker, Docker, Docker a reality soon. Watch this space.
Oh no.
It really is turtles all the way now. Now, Git has its own alias support. For example, I alias git blame to git shame because that's how we use it. But that doesn't always go far enough because all those aliases within Git are prefaced by the word Git, and you don't always want to do that. If you want to do something else, you've got to back out into shell aliases. For example, you can do this and wrap it around other commands. Now, why in the world would I want to do this? Now would be a great time for me to point out that you invited me to speak here. And of all the talks, you chose to come to this one this morning. This is on you, not on me. Okay, more Git. I feel like Git really should be using this as their tagline on their page. They can have this slogan, it's licensed under Creative Commons, it's all them. Now, we've all heard about rebasing the master branch and then pushing it, the hilarious prank that everyone at your office will enjoy. Because what that does is it changes history so that everyone gets screwed. And the baseline of what people thought has come before has now suddenly shifted, and that's generally not a good thing. For those of you who saw my Docker talk yesterday, I made this joke, so I'm sorry for repeating it. But a group of whales is called a pod, a group of ravens is called a murder, and a group of developers is called a merge conflict. Again, I work in operations. I don't have time for that. So I use this because it's simpler.
You're a horrible person.
The comment from the audience was that I'm a horrible person. We are now 13 and a half minutes into the talk, and they're just realizing this.
We want to give you the benefit of the doubt.
Thank you. That's kind of you. Foolish, but kind. Okay. And on a more serious note, if someone does this, you've got a few options. You can force push from a good copy. You can wind up changing it back, revert from a good commit. But there's not really a great answer to this. It depends entirely on what they force pushed. So joking aside, let's not do that. Okay. We've shown that Git is fantastic at making us feel stupid. Let's talk about how we can help Git make us feel smarter. For example, you ever wind up doing something like that? You mistype something, and then it comes back, and it tells you that, oh, did you mean status? Idiot. Yeah, it doesn't have to necessarily do that. And I'll go through this command in a minute explaining what it does. Note what it does here. Specifically now, by setting that argument, instead of winding up just telling me that I'm using the wrong command, it warns me that I've called a command called status, which doesn't exist, continuing under the assumption that I meant status. It then gives me 0.8 seconds to frantically whack Control-C before it does something horrific. And then it goes ahead and runs the command. Let's break down what that command actually does. Git config is rather obviously how you wind up setting config options in Git. And there are three places that this command will set that. The default with no flag is repository specific. Sometimes helpful, sometimes not what you want. Global is where it puts it in your user directory. There's a .git config, and that's what it edits. And if you use the -- system option, it'll store it in etc git config, which is everywhere on that system for all users. Generally, that is used only for a few specific things because it's really confusing when Git behaves differently based upon which system you're on. And this is awesome, and it works well. What it does, instead that 8 is tenths of a second it will wait for you to frantically kill it. You can set that to something longer, like 80. It'll wait 8 full seconds. We call that the wait of shame, as you sit there wishing you had just been a little bit more accurate with your typing. And this is great, but it does have limitations. For example, it only works when there's only one command that it's going to use. If I typed in git c, for example, and hit enter, it'll do nothing. Do I mean checkout? Do I mean config? Do I mean clone? It'll bomb and give out. And it doesn't work on everything. All right, how often has something like this happened for you? You add a remote. Oh, hey, there we are. The demo gods always like to spite me. Okay, so you add a remote. You tell it to push, and it comes back with, you're not tracking the upstream master. So you get angry, and you start swearing into your terminal. And then it works. Incidentally, it's not just for Git. This is a command that someone wound up writing. It's a to do what I mean, not what I say script. And more impressive than the technical achievement, this has the #1 result on Google when you Google for the term the fuck. That's amazing.
Is it integrated with fuck off as a service?
Not yet, but pull requests are welcome. Okay. Now, humor aside, I do have 3 tools that I want to demonstrate today, and they tend to play very nicely with each other. So let's face an uncomfortable truth for a minute here. Speaking as a manager myself, a lot of people have a somewhat disturbing propensity to treat managers like we're semi-intelligent squirrels, constantly looking around for something shiny. You're right. When I started at my current job, before I started managing a team, I was the team. There was a monitor sitting next to my desk that historically was what people used to look at the status of the site. The monitoring system was no longer working. Now, I fixed that, but that wasn't the top of my burning fires list. You really don't want to know what was. So I wanted to do something with that would at least occasion comment and trick people into making the fatal error of speaking to me. So I figured I would do something a little bit different, and it worked better than I would have expected. This is a tool called Gorse. It takes a second to get spun up on large repositories. But what it effectively does is it reads the Git history, takes a look at every commit that happens, plays through it, and winds up at that point. Let me forward it to the point where this is a little more interesting than at the beginning of an open source project. Let's go midway through. You see a visualization of what's happened historically on this. And at first it was, oh, that's neat, but it's mesmerizing. And people kept looking at it and coming by my desk. And then they started telling stories back in the early days of the company, when everyone involved was a team of 5 and everyone coded. And you'd see, for example, the CEO going in and making changes to files. And then immediately our founding engineer would come in and revert all of those changes. And it becomes a bit of a shared narrative around what had been there. Install Gors, go into a directory, run the command, you're done. Didn't take much to get it going, but we now are getting a separate screen just for this. Just because it turned into a nice cultural phenomenon there. If you need something pretty in a hurry, it's not half bad. Audience participation time. Let's start with a poll. Who here cares about more than one Git repository? If you look around and see people without their hands raised, they probably work at Facebook.
Ouch.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, that was vicious. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to imply any of you people worked for Facebook. It's cool. No. And it sucks to get on a plane and realize that you're missing the latest changes from that one repository you really, really need to get something done. Like a conference talk. Now, Mark Atwood does a lot of open source work over at HP. And he posted a decent solution to the problem here. You just punch a find command into a for loop to find Git repos, iterate over it, fetch the latest changes and leave your repository's parent, and oh dear, I've lost just about everyone because this is boring as hell. So this is awesome, except for the part where it's shitty. So I'll do something like this maybe once at most, but I'm not going to do it every time I need to pull my repositories. So I quote back at him. I took his stupid loop, but instead of running git fetch, I ran a command called mrregister instead. And within minutes, he responded. Now, I want to point out that this is a guy who's forgotten more about software than I'll ever learn. And he still was thrilled to find this thing and thanked me for it. We're usually not the first person to have a particular problem. So ask people. That's part of the point of conferences. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants in the technology space. And everyone around us, everyone in this room, has holes in their knowledge and doesn't realize it. And every one of us knows something obvious that if they shared it would be an oh my god, that's amazing moment for the rest of us. So, let's talk about what MR is and does. Originally it was just called MR, so then they wound up changing it to make it easier to find, but I still haven't gotten the hang of it yet, so if it is it MR, is it my repos, depends on what distro you're on. They took the computer science hard problem of naming things and managed to make it worse by renaming something. So, the way that it works is relatively straightforward. You start off by running mrregister once the program is installed inside of a given repository. You could do it with a loop through an automated system. You can go in and run it by hand. It doesn't really matter because this is something you only have to do once. What this does is it builds out a configuration file in your home directory called .mrconfig. Then you run update and watch as it updates everything in series. Where are we hiding? There we go. And now we're out of Docker. Okay. So we take a look at my mrconfig. It winds up in doing a bunch of includes, which we'll get to in a bit, but you can break things out that way. And it lists a few different repositories. For example, the three primary projects that comprise the Puppet project. It identifies where each one of them lives, and then one for Salt. I can do an MR status. It iterates through all 30 of mine, tells me the status on all of them. And I can do an MR up. And if the internet actually works here, because conference Wi-Fi is always a little dodgy, what it winds up doing is going through in series and updating these things. One by one by one by one. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me... Yeah. Yeah, that was MR up. Sorry. Yes?
You just said MR status goes through and shows you information about the 30 or so repositories you care about.
Yes.
But the config file you showed us listed, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5.
Correct, because there was an include in there that listed other files that I can include as well. And something interesting as well that winds up working out, great question here. If I go into Workspace, for example, and do MR status again, it only tells me about 12 repositories instead of 30, because inside of this workspace, I now have just a subset of my repositories. That's how you can wind up doing grouping intelligently in this. It also takes a J flag similar to make, where if I give it a J8, it now winds up going out and updating in parallel 8 at a time rather than 1 at a time. MR doesn't just support Git. It also supports Subversion, Mercurial, a whole handful of others. You'll note that Perforce isn't on the list because it's crappy, but patches are welcome, which is the open source phrase for go away kid, you bother me. Now, I wouldn't know about this tool myself if a stodgy German friend of mine hadn't told me about this. And this is really what makes or breaks open source projects. Docker absolutely nails this with the inverse Fight Club model. The first rule of Docker is never shut the fuck up about Docker. And that German friend of mine told me about this in conjunction with a tool that he had written. It's a version control system for your dot files. Who here has a global dot files repository? Okay, a few people with hands going up. It generally looks something a lot like this. And it's a great first pass, but it's kind of crappy in that you're simultaneously keeping your bash RC in the same repository as your vim config, and it also gets annoying to start tracking these between different systems. I don't want the Git repository that has my personal AWS account credentials in it unencrypted. I know, I still do terrible things on my work machine, because I don't want to accidentally spin up something for work and wind up costing myself a giant pile of money because I used the wrong credentials and oops, that's in my personal account. Wow, those things are expensive. Conversely, I don't want my work credentials on my personal machine because that's how you get sued. So, there we are. VCSH. It winds up listing out a number of different repositories that I'm managing and tells me the status of these. So, in this case, if I type VCSH vim, a few things have happened. I want to point out first and foremost, actually let's do this in my home directory, there we are. Now, I'm currently in my home directory. And if I do a git status, it tells me the only file in my home directory that's been modified is the vimrc file that I've told it, this repository to track. So I can make any changes I want. I can add, commit, push, etc. And then I can get out of the repository. I still wind up in the same place. I run git status without being in VCSH, and it doesn't notice that I'm in a repository. What this is doing is under the hood. So under the hood looks like this. Specifically, it's putting the repository tracking and remote files somewhere else entirely. In this case, it winds up keeping the repository itself under a .config, which is a directory which follows a Debian standard. Not every distro uses this, but it's a nice pattern, so I stole it. It then winds up keeping the repositories here. This is the entire list of available repositories that you could teach, that VCSH is aware of in all of your environments. And then you just symlink the ones that you want on this machine. The beauty of doing something like this is that way, until I wind up linking it in and doing a pull with my credentials, none of these things live on my machine. So the S3 command data, for example, doesn't live anywhere on this box other than a pointer to the repository it lives in. If you have anything approaching a reasonable security model for things you care about, that's not going to be enough to get the data out of it. Then, once you end up going into the repository and it automatically checks things out, like your ZSH RC, it drops it into your home directory. Incidentally, so now you've broken your single global .files repository up into about 10 or 15, depending on how many different programs you want to track, and MR lets you update all of these things in parallel. Okay, there are two more tricks that I want to show you here. And one of them I've been showing you all along. Where are we hiding? There we are. If we take a look, when I'm in a Git repository, you'll notice my prompt is changing. It tells me a few different things, although it may not be immediately obvious. It tells me that I'm on the master branch, which is the default branch in a Git repository, and you see that red dot next to the 1. That tells me that there's a change to be committed. So once I go ahead and make that commit, it changes to a check mark, and there's a 1 with an arrow pointing up next to it. That tells me that my branch is ahead of its remote by 1. This isn't exposing anything you can't get at with Git status, but it also provides a constant, unobtrusive indicator of what I'm doing and where I am. Once I started doing something like this, I found the incidences of doing things like accidentally committing to the wrong branch started going down a lot. And that was extremely helpful in and of itself. The second thing that I've done that I wanted to demonstrate here. So we took a poll earlier. Everyone here is using Git. How many people are using GitHub? And just about every hand in the room goes up. Well, here in this demo, I haven't really been using Git like you think I have. Because there's a program that GitHub has written called Hub. And what that does is it winds up wrapping around a number of different GitHub-specific commands. And anything it doesn't recognize, it then just passes directly through to Git. So if I run git help, note at the bottom it says these GitHub commands are provided by Hub. I can now create pull requests from the command line. The first time you try to do it, it'll ask you for your username, password, and ideally your multi-factor auth code. It never stores these things, but it does generate an API key that you then wind up storing, and it can then forever authenticate as you. This really opens up some interesting possibilities because it's a very easy integration with the GitHub API. You can now have scripts that automatically do things with pull requests or forking. You can git browse and open this thing in a browser automatically. It's not a necessity, but it really does streamline a number of workflow models that work out well. So here's a link to everything that I've mentioned today. I'm going to leave that up on the board while I answer your questions. And these questions don't necessarily have to be about anything I've explicitly mentioned. Please feel free to ask your stupid Git question that everyone's going to nod like, duh, how don't they know that? But they're going to also take notes frantically as the answer is exposed. So questions, comments, snarky concerns. Yes, you in the back, sir.
All right. So Git and GitHub has become the major format for open source projects, whether they're code or not.
Mm-hmm.
So when it's not, and I want to share my ego files and keep track of how the things were changed and have more people working on them, what is the best approach? Because Git, it keeps track of how text gets changed, and for anything else, it becomes really hard.
Yes. The question, if I can distill that down, just to repeat for people watching and listening in the far future. Hi, Mom. The only person who watches these videos. So what you're saying is, I understand you correctly, is what about using Git for tracking things that are not, I guess, text files? Are you talking about static assets? Are you talking about things like Word documents?
Similar to Word documents or SolidWorks files or et cetera.
Yeah. The answer to that, in my experience, is that concepts from Git apply very well. But for better or worse, Git probably is not the proper tool for this. That's why in a lot of legal shops, for example, lawyers have document collaboration systems. That's why they love track changes and then email Word files back and forth like it's 1980. But there really is that. I think that while you're right, this is the de facto standard for sharing things in an open source code-driven world. It's not going to be the proper tool for everyone. I don't see a world, for example, in which architects are sending back and forth CAD designs using GitHub. I just don't see it. I think that that's a more specialized niche that's probably best suited for another tool. Yes, sir.
I'd like to just amplify what you said. I've spent an embarrassing amount of time with the Git IRC channel, and the consensus on this is if you can't merge it, Git is not the right tool. Because merging is what Git does well, and if you lose that, then you're not really gaining anything by using Git.
Exactly. The emphasis was that if you're not merging anything, that you're not, that Git is probably not the right tool.
Using binary files, they're
Yes.
not going to merge.
At that point, you're using it as a file hosting service, and there are better answers there.
Right.
Yes?
On the last item on the hub commands, I'm assuming that can also work on a local instance of GitHub?
Yes, you can define a specific, the question is, can you use hub on a local copy of GitHub Enterprise? The answer is yes, you can define an endpoint that it speaks to. Just be careful with that, because when you go back and forth between using something off of public GitHub and something on local GitHub, it's sometimes going to not do the thing you would expect.
Okay.
Yeah. All the questions come from this side of the room. I think I bored this half. Other questions, concerns, comments, disguised as questions? Anyone? Yes?
There's a lot of hidden stuff that Git can help you do to protect yourself as well. So there are some config options you can turn on that will help you to prevent people from trashing your repos.
Yes.
That's something to mention for.
No, you're right. The comment was that there's a number of different hidden commands in Git that you can use to prevent people from trashing your repos. And you're right. And a lot of this winds up being dependent on certain support on things server side as well. For example, GitHub somewhat recently rolled out a feature where it prevented force pushing to designated branches. That's a great way of keeping people from changing history. Everyone's familiar with git blame, which you wind up having where you wind up with being able to go through a file line by line and you see which commit and which author were the last person to touch each line. This leads to another great open source project on GitHub called, and I'm not making this up, Git blame someone else, where it goes back and it will rewrite a commit in the past and attribute it to someone else. And then it says, and it gives the name you've given it and says, such and such is now the author of commit, and it gives the hash, you are officially an asshole. Now, it's funny, but it's important pointing this out, that if you are serious about this stuff, you are definitely going to want to enable signing of your commits using some form of PGP or GPG, depending on what side of that fence you're on. And because without that, Git just looks at a history, assigns it by email address, and it just assumes things are right. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, but remember that by default, most commits are not necessarily proof positive that the person in question authored them. That's why GPG signing starts to become an idea. Now, this doesn't apply to 99% of people's use cases, but there are a few scenarios that do exist for that, which is why I bring this up. Yes?
Have you seen any features in any other version control systems that you wish that Git would take?
That's a really good question. Do I see any features in other version control systems that I wish Git would take? And the answer to that is sort of. I know I made fun of it earlier, but one feature that I particularly like in Perforce is that you can see who has checked something out, and you can limit people's access to certain parts of a repository, not the entire thing. Now, I don't see Git ever implementing that because it's antithetical to the entire model that Git is built around of collaborative sharing. But there is value to that in a lot of enterprise code bases, which is why Perforce still has a relatively decent market share in the enterprise space. That's convenient, and I feel like if Git had something akin to that, I wouldn't be stuck using Perforce in some shops. There is a new git p4 command, which effectively does a lot of translation, so it's getting closer. But Git is also, incidentally, embracing a lot of other other version control systems, specifically with being able to interact with them, but still locally you use all of your Git commands to, the way you typically would to wind up making commits following a somewhat similar branching and merging strategy. So if you're going to if you don't know anything about any version control system, start with Git. It's the one that's eating the world rapidly. Yes.
With Git, are there any particular like workflow problems you see people do where like in some shop with the developers
there's someone who is like obviously merging and like making branches at wrong times.
Have you ever seen that not happen? Okay. The question was: do I ever see any workflow problems with developers committing to the wrong branch, making branches incorrectly, pushing things they shouldn't? And my snarky, sarcastic answer is, of course, have you ever not seen that? And yeah, I don't think anyone pretends that Git is simple or straightforward, but I do think that there's a learning curve for everything. That's incidentally why I'm not permitting people to force push to master by having certain code review tools like Gerrit requiring someone else to sign off before something gets merged in winds up adding value. And a lot of it is just educational to some extent. That's also why, as a part of a deploy pipeline, most shops, despite having automated testing to a greater or lesser degree, we hope for greater, we usually get lesser, there's still a human element of reviewing things and making sure that things wind up working. For example, as part of our change management process, every commit that we make has to mention a Jira ticket, so it gets linked back into Jira automatically through some automation we have. In the event it does not, it winds up getting automatically rejected as a pull request. Yes?
Do you have an opinion on the rebase
yes.
religion?
Sorry, what's the question?
Do you have an opinion on the rebase religion versus the branch and merge religion, and why?
Sure. The question is do I have an opinion on merging-based strategies versus rebase-based strategies? And the answer to that is yes. If you're talking about a place without a lot of automated tooling around it, I vastly prefer merging, because it's a lot easier to look back at what happened and where things were brought in. With a rebase, for those who are unfamiliar with rebase as a concept, what you're doing in most rebases is you are playing another branch onto your branch and leaving your changes at the tip. So that does change history to some extent. Now, that said, if you can use something like Fabricator, which came out of Facebook, that winds up landing these changes on using a rebase-based workflow, it leads to a very nice history, because there's an automated system rather than a fickle humans working on this. So your history is an unbroken single line of commits. This change, then this change, then this change. You don't accidentally wind up playing Guitar Hero in Git because you have that many different branches strewn across something. Yes?
You mentioned using GPG. Is that a plugin for Git? Do you have an external tool that you use with Git? I guess how do you implement that?
Yes, there's a -- signed option on the commits. I'm sorry, the question is how do you implement GPG signing with Git? There's a -- signed option to the commit flag, which then automatically calls out to the GPG library that winds up doing that for you. Okay. To be very honest with you, despite advocating for it, I've never actually done it. So, again, most of what I do, if someone else claims credit for a commit, it's not the end of the world. Other questions? Perfect. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate your time.